Hello, everybody. My name is Aziz Rana. I teach law at Boston College and study the Constitution as well as ideas of freedom. I have a book called The Two Faces of American Freedom that came out about 10 years ago, and I have a new book that's about to come out called The Constitutional Bind, How Americans Came to Idolize a Document That Fails Us. I'm here as a participant in a recent Boston Review forum called Reclaiming Freedom. And I'm here alongside a series of wonderful co-participants that I'll like to introduce in just a moment in a bit greater depth. But first, I'll just say their names. So we have Elizabeth Anker, Mark Paul, and William Clary Roberts. The forum is itself a real collaborative product. There were a number of participants that took part in it, and there's also various people that I'd like to thank up front. So John McDonald at Haymarket for all of his work putting this together, as well as everybody at Haymarket. The folks at Boston Review that did a terrific job with the editing. So Deb Chasman, Matt Lord, and Josh Cohen. Now, the idea behind the forum was really to think about the state of freedom as a concept in American politics today. And in particular, I think many of us were struck by a very specific state of affairs in the US. The fact that freedom as a concept is something that we really think of or associate with the political left. That broadly speaking, ideas of freedom have circulated in many of the kind of emancipation and liberation struggles that the world has seen. So fights against slavery and segregation, patriarchy, colonialism, labor struggles for workers have all been deeply associated with the idea of freedom. And in many ways, we can think of it globally as a language of the left. And yet, in the US today, if you were to hear somebody just sort of invoke the term or say that their freedoms were under attack, almost inevitably, we would imagine that that person is someone from the political right, and that the folks that tend to use the term freedom are very much associated not just with the right, but with an especially corrosive brand of conservative politics that seems increasingly present in collective life. And so the volume, in a way, wanted to explore this. How is it that a language that's so deeply embedded in the politics and traditions of the left is now in the US claimed, if not exclusively, then really substantially by right-wing figures and activists? And in order to do that, we had to then sort of engage with broad questions about, first, is this the case? Is this a matter of the right being successful at claiming narratives? Has the left and liberal forces just abandoned the field? Perhaps is that a good thing because the language of freedom might have embedded within it certain kinds of corrosive features that sort of suggest control over outsiders and others? So should freedom be something that folks on the left are interested in at all? And more generally, to the extent that freedom is something that's worth reclaiming, what should its substantive content be? Should there be a much more expansive and kind of emancipatory horizon of what constitutes freedom? Or should freedom be organized through the everyday or through experiences of oppression that really focus on protection from rather than positive or expansive commitments to? So to kind of engage with all of this stuff, again, we've got Elizabeth, Mark, and Will here. So Libby Anker is a professor of American Studies and Political Science at George Washington University. She's also the director of film studies there. Her work is in political theory and cultural studies with a focus on really the practices of freedom, violence, and power in U.S. politics and culture. She's the author of numerous books and articles. I'll just note two books, Ugly Freedoms, which is out recently from Duke University Press, and Orgies of Feeling, Melodrama and the Politics of Freedom, which was also out from Duke University Press. We also have Mark Paul, who's a professor at the Blaustein School of Planning and Public Policy at Rutgers. Mark has a PhD in economics and works on equality, its causes, consequences, and possible remedies. He also writes on climate change and just published a new book, congratulations, The Ends of Freedom, Reclaiming America's Lost Promise of Economic Rights from Chicago University Press. And then finally, we have William Clare Roberts, who's a professor of political science, teaches political science at McGill. Will is a political theorist who, among other topics, explores Marx and Marxism, ancient Greek political philosophy, classical political economy, socialism, republicanism, theories of domination. Will is working now on a book called Radical Politics of Freedom and is the author of Marx's Inferno, the political theory of capital, that was published by Princeton University Press. So I think our plan for the next 90 minutes or so is that each of us is going to begin with just a kind of short distillation of our contributions to the volume, and then say 5 minutes or so. And then after kind of working through our own comments, we're gonna have a conversation amongst each other, asking each other questions about our pieces, and maybe that'll take us through the hour, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. And as somebody taking the moderator's prerogative, I'll begin by just sort of laying out the argument that I made in my piece. So for my contribution to the volume, I basically made an argument defending the need for the left to reclaim the language of freedom, but also saying that there are deep structural reasons beyond just this specific political moment why the right seems to have a particular kind of cultural purchase on arguments about freedom in the US that might actually be distinct in various ways from what we see globally. And so I'm just going to work through my own claims by focusing on 3 different points that I made. The first point is that in order to be able to understand the structural context in which freedom arguments tend to have regressive or right-wing connotations in the US, it's really important to link the domestic American story to the global context, and in particular to appreciate the extent to which the US is now and has been historically an experiment in various forms of imperial power. Okay, so let me just unpack this a little bit. That in the US, at various moments in time, there have been really rich traditions of freedom, oftentimes connected to concrete manifestations of their opposite, of slavery, exploitation, and oppression on the ground. And these traditions of freedom have routinely emphasized ideas of self-rule. In other words, to be free means more than just not facing coercive power or the whims of arbitrary authority, but to actually enjoy something like control over the conditions of one's own life and the ability collectively to participate in shared decision-making about the most central sites of institutional life: economic, political, spiritual. And there have been 2 basic ways in which you could imagine this kind of expansive idea of freedom and self-rule taking place. One way of thinking about it is that, well, in a complex society, whether in the 19th century or today, that in order for people genuinely to be free, then they're going to have to actually work together. Freedom requires solidarity, democracy, inclusiveness. Its function depends on recognizing that you can't be free and a self-mastering person on your own, that economic independence requires interdependence. And so it's closely bound to participatory politics, to accounts of workplace democracy, and to really a vision of what we might think of as social democratic possibility in American life. But then there's always been another way of pursuing freedom, which conceives of freedom as zero sum, a fight over scarce resources, and entailing that my own freedom has to come necessarily at the expense of others, because not everyone can enjoy the benefits of collective life. And that particular brand of individualistic, atomized, zero-sum notions of self-mastery and self-rule, oftentimes in the US have been profoundly racialized because of the structures of slavery and its legacy. But more than that, there's been this other feature, which is the US was founded and grounded in a particular experiment in what I call settler empire. In other words, that early colonists were committed to a rich account of freedom, but they believed that in order to be able to benefit from that, they would have to have access to land, and they would have to enjoy the benefits of what you can think of as free labor, that their own work life couldn't be grounded in degraded or coercive brands of economic control. And they solved this problem through the expropriation of indigenous land and through the use of coerced labor, particularly over enslaved Black people, their descendants, and then other migrant populations like the Chinese and Asian Americans in the late 19th, early 20th century. And at various moments in American life, in many ways, the politics of empire
smoothed over the debates about freedom by making something like self-rule actually available for a small range of people. And across American history, what this has done is it's created moments in time in which, for some to enjoy the benefits of freedom, that this kind of racialized account has felt like it's real and achievable. And it transforms a language that could be one that's universal, inclusive, and solidaristic into a language that is perhaps most culturally expressed within mainstream dominant life by a kind of libertarian, individualistic, atomized, individualized account of politics. So then, two, what does this mean? For me, this means that we shouldn't abandon freedom as a concept. And for a couple reasons. First, the fact that it's corrosive is in a way endemic to any notion of liberation or emancipation. That all ideas of freedom are bound or connected to the experiences of subordination that might exist on the ground. And for that reason, that projects of transforming social conditions necessarily link, forms of unfreedom and forms of freedom together. And so the fact that there's a kind of corrosive history isn't something to then say we should reject all emancipatory discourses or language. And at the same time, throughout American history, there have also been, movements from those that are oppressed at the margins to break through the terms that have been dominant, to create universal accounts of liberation. We see this within Black freedom struggles, within the labor movement, within indigenous politics and indigenous notions of self-determination, in which the idea of liberation, of freedom as self-rule, is something that is radicalized as a way of thinking about how freedom, democracy, and inclusion can actually be linked together. And indeed, to abandon the concept would be to do a disservice to the ways in which people that are most oppressed have conceived of their own politics and have turned, let's say, a struggle just to limit or restrain the most extreme forms of violence that they experience into an account of how one can actually live together in something that is genuinely utopian in the best sense. And so if that's the case, if there's both a corrosive history and it's a concept that shouldn't be abandoned, then what should we do now? And this is my third and final point, which is this highlights that the problem that the left has around freedom is a problem of narrative, but it's narrative grounded in sort of institutional and structural reality. In other words, that the right's advantages, because they're tied to the long sort of frameworks of imperial politics in American life, are advantages that have created sort of organic cultural ties between the way conservatives present and conceive of freedom and the kind of bedrock institutions of fundamentalist kind of market politics, racialized capitalism, unequal forms of voting rights and representation. And that in order to respond effectively, those on the left both have to articulate and defend powerful accounts of emancipation and equal and effective freedom for all, but they have to do so while reconstructing actually existing institutions. In other words, by creating an institutional landscape in which left ideas emerge organically, or kind of culturally connected to how people live and experience their workplaces, their schools, their neighborhoods. And that means, perhaps counterintuitively, the best way to actually pursue a program of freedom is to change the institutional terrain by altering, for example, the politics around things like voting, the way in which people inhabit their workplaces, the extent to which workplaces are profoundly hierarchical, combating foreign policy because of the ways in which American empire ends up feeding back into these zero-sum, belligerent, and highly nationalistic forms of individualized, atomized accounts of liberty. And also shaping, altering the way that we think of immigration politics, and the question of the border, which is a modern variant of longstanding modes of separating individuals on the basis of race and membership. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Libby Anker. So take it away with your contribution to the volume.
Great. Thanks for the nice introduction. My piece is thinking about the ways in which we still continue to idealize freedom. let me explain what I mean. The forum for Boston Review are the special issues about reclaiming freedom. It's about reclaiming freedom broadly from the right in many ways that Aziz has just mentioned, right? Reclaiming freedom from free market versions of freedom that entail the freedom to exploit others for capital. It entails white supremacist versions of freedom that entail dominating non-white people. It's about reclaiming freedom from masculinist versions of freedom that entail controlling the lives and reproductive futures of others, as well as the freedom to enforce gender and sexual conformity. It also entails reclaiming freedom from settler colonial versions of freedom, which practice freedom in ways that include stealing territory and dispossessing populations. We know that freedom is in many ways the most popular value in the American political lexicon, but it has often been exercised in these ways, these right-wing ways, what I call in my recent book, ugly freedoms, when freedom is practiced as subjugation or oppression. Throughout American history, practices of freedom have included enslavement and exploitation alongside independence and emancipation. While Americans especially tend to hold freedom as their highest political value, their practices of freedom have often been tyrannical. The American Revolution, for example, a galvanizing enactment of collective freedom, was also at the exact same time a brutal and destructive process of indigenous dispossession that ravaged indigenous life worlds, something that Aziz showed us in his first book. Well into the 20th century, married men legally practiced freedom as domestic violence as part of their freedoms for privacy. The imperial destructions of the War on Terror was considered a war of freedom against fear, as George W. Bush insisted. All of these are ugly freedoms and shows us the way in which freedom has long been practiced as both non-domination and domination, as both unbound agency and forced bondage, as emancipation and constraint. Aziz's opening argument for this forum importantly argues that we need to reclaim freedom back from these forms of ugliness to get back to its more both emancipating and non-dominating forms. Aziz asks us to reclaim left lineages of collective freedom for what he describes as a profound reimagining of how economic and political self-rule can spread in American life. And I think this is incredibly important. And I also think that we can look for freedoms in a somewhat different way. When we stop idealizing freedom, not only by looking at its ugliness on the right, but also sometimes the way in which we imagine it on the left, we can help to reckon not only with the domination that certain freedoms entail, but we can also discover other meaningful forms of freedom that might not track with our familiar expectations for inspiring forms of political agency, for liberatory modes of self-rule, or even for moral certainty in the way in which we organize our political and economic institutions. We often presume that freedom requires courageous subjects or inspiring collective actions, and ultimately that it manifests in some form of self-determination. This is the kind of freedoms that we find in some of the most important and central thinkers of our modern era, from Karl Marx to Emma Goldman to Frantz Fanon. But I think this can also leave out some of the more mundane and non-cathartic, but still worthwhile freedoms that are present in everyday life. So de-idealizing freedoms on the left can help to open space to explore freedom practices that we might not imagine or hope for as grand or upright, but might be minor and compromised, yet can still do generative work to help to fight for a world without exploitation and domination. De-idealizing freedom in the way in which I'm envisioning it is not trying to relinquish freedom as a practice or as an aspiration, and not even to relinquish it in some of the more galvanizing forms in which we'll be discussing today. But it is about relinquishing the expectation that our practices of freedom have to always be grand or honorable in order to do freedom work. De-idealizing freedom can help us to develop freedoms that might be far removed from things like self-mastery or brave resistance or triumphant emancipation, but can still do important work. In the forum for Boston Review, I shared an example of a pretty tawdry and mundane form of freedom that I think might otherwise signify a kind of embarrassing weakness, which is the social media circulation of the white boots DeSantis meme, which was derived from a picture taken of the governor wearing giant white water boots while he was examining hurricane damage. DeSantis staged this photo op in order to display himself as a heroic, masculinized protector and to align his vision with his freedom agenda, which is in many ways the ugliest of ugly freedoms, a freedom that is manifesting in anti-Black, anti-queer forms of political authoritarianism that wield state power like a weapon against weak and marginalized people. And yet the circulation of this meme on social media undercut DeSantis's self-burnishing performance of mastery. Right? On the one hand, it's obvious that nothing might signify freedom less than a juvenile meme that carries no political power and that reeks of slacktivism. Yet the meme undermined DeSantis's claims for authoritarianism with a shared political performance among aligned people that emphasized a kind of horizontal solidarity among a wide variety of disparate people who are together taking the low road to spoil DeSantis's performance. They crafted an ad hoc network that was built on their own kind of weakened agency and lowbrow behavior, oftentimes the very things that seem to signal a kind of unfreedom. But they used that to shift the national narrative of DeSantis's power and started the weakening that we're seeing circulating across the country today. The meme certainly worked alongside more iconic forms of freedom, like organized movement protests, social justice activism, and lawyers filing protests against some of DeSantis's unconstitutionality. But the meme gave people who may have felt they otherwise lacked power or a voice, a way to work together, because it only works when it's together, a way to work together to challenge DeSantis's claims for freedom rule. This kind of easy circulation was readily available to college students shuttling between 3 jobs, overworked caregivers, dispirited Floridians, homebound people, frustrated teens, and scared queer and trans adolescents wondering what the future in Florida has for them. It was not galvanizing, and it did not overthrow DeSantis's freedom agenda. But de-idealizing freedom shows how this circulation was able to cultivate a low-key freedom under the radar of ideal visions, even when it is at the same time compromised, banal, and perhaps even discomforting to call this kind of small and minor act a performance of freedom. And yet I think to reckon with the complex legacy of freedom in the US is to see that there are many ways to enact freedom, some good, some bad, and some ugly. De-idealizing freedom does not reject transformative, inspiring actions, but aims to expand freedom's practice to include actions that might otherwise seem too ineffectual to build common worlds or too uninspiring compared to more courageous and transformative actions. It can help us to identify and practice imperfect, muted, and unglamorous experiments that can still fight against exploitation and help us to craft new experiments in living free. Thanks.
Great, thanks so much. Mark?
Thanks for that, Livia. It was really, really insightful. So it was wonderful to be here with you all this evening. Really appreciate Boston Review and Haymarket for organizing this. So I love talking about freedom. It's our strongest, I think, most powerful, for better or worse, as we're going to talk about a lot this evening, political idea and identity. But as others have already laid out, the very idea of freedom is contested terrain. After all, as historian Eric Foner notes, whoever controls the idea of freedom really does control our master narrative, at least here in the United States. Of course, in other countries, other ideas resonate far more with the electorate. But here in the United States, it's really about freedom. But what we mean when we speak about freedom, and as Aziz really highlighted at the get-go, who it applies to, who gets to wield, the power and benefits of those who are, free at any given time, has always, really been a area of, extreme controversy. And this has been the case since the idea of America really took root. One thing that I really don't think is going to be controversial this evening is and something I would hope we would largely agree on, is that the right, however, today is completely winning the fight for the control over our master narrative here in the United States around freedom. The prominent political idea of freedom really has been owned by the political right for more than half a century, certainly for my entire lifetime. Now, what does the right mean when they speak of freedom? Often we think it's boiled down to this notion of negative freedom, which I borrow from the philosopher Isaiah Berlin, freedom from constraint or freedom from coercion, which is interesting because that's quite different than what we were speaking of earlier tonight, talking about freedom exercises, domination and coercion over others. But the kind of simple story that's often told is freedom is manifested through limited government, minimum taxation, and most importantly, access to quote unquote free markets. And here I think we see how powerful the idea of freedom is in developing and maintaining a capitalist state, which is it's not just about markets, it's about free markets. Of course, we know that this notion of free markets is a fictitious one, right? That a free market simply cannot exist. But to be sure, capitalism, in particular, the flavor of capitalism we've largely experienced here in the United States, isn't about limited government. It isn't just about freedom from coercion. It's really about the domination and coercion of certain people within society, largely workers and those outside of the dominant group, which has historically been white men here in the United States, who then have that freedom, that right to subjugate others. Now, this, of course, isn't the freedom I think that we're all hoping to work towards, which then brings the question of, do we want to reclaim freedom, or do we, kind of move past and think of freedom as an idea that has been sufficiently poisoned, and one that is no longer able to be wielded by those seeking a more just and equitable and democratic society. But I think that despite the fact that the right really has owned the language war, I always think of this notion of building more enduring freedom. But we all know enduring freedom, of course, is code name for devastating war in Afghanistan. Nevertheless, I think that we shouldn't give up on these narratives. I think it's crucial that we that we think about freedom, a more robust version of freedom, as one where people are able to develop their capabilities, their passions, their relationships, and to be part of a healthy and thriving democratic society where people have a say not only in the political realm, but in the economic realm that governs their lives. I mean, it's fascinating to me how we just implicitly accept this firewall in our society where we talk about democracy and how it's allowed within politics. Of course, it's under fire increasingly, but we almost never talk about democracy when it comes to the workplace where we spend most of our waking hours. And so, thinking about a broader vision of freedom must entail thinking about how we deepen democracy, not only in the political realm, but in the economic realm as well. Now, I want to be careful here, and I don't think that reclaiming freedom is just about a political sparring, a narrative sparring match. This isn't just about saying freedom more. This isn't just about, stumping on the idea. I mean, President Biden launched his campaign re-election all on freedom, although it was very unclear what he meant when he wielded the term. But that said, I think stories matter a tremendous amount. And that's the contribution that I tried to make for the Boston Review, that we need a story of progressive, inclusive, democratic freedom so that people actually have a North Star to really understand what it is that we are working towards. And I think that, more than anything, is something that I've been craving for the left to develop in my own lifetime. It's something that I think is starting to coalesce. But really, that's a more recent development, and something I think that has largely been missing. Looking to kind of the massive political changes and kind of the development of an actual, more progressive political force here in the United States over the the past 8 or so years, I think we see individuals really grappling with what it is that they're working towards. And there's lots of ideas, but the problem is a laundry list doesn't convince people. We need a coherent, I think well-articulated idea of what we mean by freedom. And here too, I think it's really important that we ground that in history. I think often we feel like we're constantly reinventing the wheel. But when it comes to freedom, we don't need to. Indeed, I think it's crucial that we kind of uncover and talk more about the long fight for freedom here in the United States. It's something that most school children today barely learn about when we think about whether it be the more radical founders or the radical Republicans, or Roosevelt's Four Freedoms and his Economic Bill of Rights, to the fight in the civil rights movement that expanded far beyond civil and political rights, but really encompassed a much more radical reorganization of society around democratic control, to a degree, of the economic means of production and economic rights as a cornerstone to people being actually free. So the people who have at least been really influential in my thinking here are folks like A. Philip Randolph and Bayard Rustin, who led in the development of this idea called a freedom budget, something that has really fallen by the wayside, unfortunately, and came into being during the height of the Vietnam War, which I think set it on challenging terrain from the get-go. But thinking about these ideas again and realizing that we aren't struggling for freedom on completely new terrain here, but that we are building on the work of people who have been fighting for this more holistic, inclusive, and democratic vision of freedom for centuries, and importantly here in the United States as a way to counter the rights claim on their kind of monopoly, so to say, on freedom and their ability to link it throughout American history. And I do want to highlight that I've really took the American approach to thinking about freedom, which of course has its own shortcomings. And I think Aziz really highlighted that nicely, and how important it is that we contend more with the role of American empire. And even if we were to provide for everybody living in the United States and in a far different manner than we do today, if that's based on the continuation of American empire, that is not actually working towards the kind of true that we should be seeking. So this is about going on the offense. It's about developing that North Star, a set of ideas, and as a policy economist, frankly, a set of policies to actually be able to talk to people about what freedom looks like. It's not just about a slogan, but it is about thinking about how, full employment or living wages or proper parental leave, or fewer working hours, providing people with more free time, expands that we need to contend with far more. I think it's something that we really struggle with here today, and something that I hope we can talk more about moving forward. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Will.
Great. Thank you, Aziz, for moderating all of this. So I was immensely pleased to be asked to be part of this issue. I've long been of the opinion that the left should build its house on the rock of freedom. But between the time that we were drafting our contributions and when the issue actually came out, I think the question of what freedom could or should mean on the left gained a new urgency. Since October 7th calls for Palestinian freedom, especially the slogan, "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free," have been called terroristic, anti-Semitic, and even genocidal. Articulating and forcefully defending a left theory of freedom in this moment, I think, is a matter of principle and an emergency measure of self-defense. Both parties in the US and most major parties right across the North Atlantic have lined up behind Israel's devastation of Gaza, which has slaughtered over 30,000 Palestinians. And to say then, as Jefferson Cowie does in this issue, and I understand Jefferson's impulses here, that we should forget freedom and argue instead for democracy, I think is fundamentally misconceived. The oppressed, the dominated, the invaded, terrorized, and enslaved, they call themselves for freedom. And if we don't defend, amplify, and act in solidarity with those calls, I don't know, what are we even doing? I think the problems and the reasonable disagreements arise when we try to spell out what this freedom we are calling for actually looks like. And here I want to push 3 points in particular. First, I think we need to separate questions of the extension of freedom from questions of its intention. And what I mean by that is that I think we need to separate questions about who should be free and to what, or for what they should be free to do, from questions of what it means to be free. I think a great deal of the disagreement between the right and the left about freedom is not actually about what freedom means, but it's about who should be free to do what. So, of course, the right thinks only some people should be free. And of course, the left thinks freedom should be enjoyed universally. I think the freedom to dominate is not necessarily a different kind or concept of freedom from the freedom that we all want. It's just an exclusive freedom, a freedom for some and at the expense of others. So I think I'm disagreeing with Aziz here to a certain extent, at least. The American right does not have an exclusive vision of freedom as opposed to the solidaristic notion that we have on the left. Solidarity and collective action among traditional or new elites is essential to the right's vision of freedom. Exclusion and solidarity go together and feed into one another on the right. And that's precisely why I think we on the left should actually not think of democracy as collective self-rule. Collective self-rule makes the question of who's in and who's out, the inclusion and exclusion from the demos, into the central political question, right? How do you define the self that is doing the ruling? So that's my first thought. Second, and this means turning to the question of what freedom means or its intention. I think freedom is or should be a power concept, right? Not oftentimes you hear of it. There's a famous articulation by Charles Taylor that differentiates between opportunity concepts of freedom and exercise concepts of freedom. And I think we should differentiate it from both of those and say it's a power concept. And I think this is where I disagree with most everyone in the issue, except actually maybe Mark. I think freedom pertains to what we can do. Libby argues in part, for example, that freedom inheres in more than exemplary or profound action. And I want to respond that I don't think freedom inheres in action at all. Actions are free only because we could also have done something else. Actions, including the banal and non-cathartic actions that Libby wants to valorize, might create or sustain freedom by augmenting or preserving our power to act with other people. But I think we easily fall into a sort of category error when we think of freedom as a set of practices, or collapse the distinction between being free and exercising that freedom in some way or another. And finally, seeing freedom as a species of power, I think, matters politically because it shows us why labor unions, state provision of non-commodity goods, and mundane opportunities to communicate spoofs and jokes with one another are also central to the left's vision of freedom and the struggle for a freer world. Unions are not institutions of freedom because they are for or for collective self-determination, but because they are counterpowers. They give workers a power of numbers and organization to counter the money power of capitalists. Guaranteed access to food, shelter, and money gives people the power to evade and escape the thumb of husbands, bosses, landlords, and other local would-be tyrants. Opportunities to poke fun at our governors give us the power to find communities of people who will support and protect us. Building institutions of freedom means building power among and for the least powerful. Power that can check and balance existing concentrations of power and dismantle domination. And I think today there's just no more urgent project on the left than building institutions of freedom for Palestine, building power among and for Palestinians so as to check and balance the overwhelming power of the Israeli-American alliance. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Will. So we thought that we would have some time to just talk amongst ourselves. And, rather than continuing as moderator here, I have questions for all of you, but maybe somebody else can jump in and pose a question, and then we can do go in a circle and have a chance to kind of discuss various themes that have come up. And then around 8 or so, we'll open it up to questions from the audience. Anybody want to jump in?
Sorry, I'm happy to start.
Go ahead.
And thanks you all for your comments, and I hope that we'll be able to continue thinking through there at their nexus. One of the things I really love about what you are all saying is the way in which you're grounding freedom in really concrete material shifts, and at the same time thinking about these questions of narrative, because I think sometimes when we think about certain aspects of leftist scholarship and the ending demand for freedom is to imagine otherwise or to act otherwise without that kind of actual specificity of what do we mean, what are institutions, what are policies, what are programs, I think that is countering a trend, and I find it really important. And my question is about how do we ensure all of the three freedoms in that we are discussing or imagining or thinking about, these reclamations, are not themselves ultimately brutal or unintentionally exploitative or end up recapitulating some of the forms of violence that we intend for them to challenge. So when we think about these kind of particular economic policies or reimagining institutions, both at a global level, at a transnational level, at a local level, what are the ways that we do that that don't end up doing so much of the work that we've seen of freedom throughout U.S. history and throughout the history of freedom practices, which is about opening up some possibilities and for closing others in ways that are incredibly violent, that are not only about excluding certain people, but exploiting them or their bodies or their labor or their land for new practices of freedom.
I'd be happy to jump in and throw in my 2 cents. I mean, I guess my opinion is that, and I think this is the easy answer. Maybe it's a bit of a cheat, but I don't think the concept of freedom is going to get us that. The ideal of freedom itself isn't going to get us that, because I think, and this is what Aziz's work pays attention to. This is what your work pays attention to. Freedom as an ideal doesn't itself differentiate between a freedom that we can all share and a freedom that is my freedom or my group's freedom, and that allows me, that I secure by oppressing you, and that you aren't allowed to have. So I guess I think we're asking too much of the concept if we want the concept itself to do that extensional work, a commitment to a sort of universality, a commitment to the rights of everyone, a commitment to everyone's claim on freedom. I think that's a separate commitment from the commitment to freedom as such.
The thing that I would just add, I don't know if this is consistent or maybe intention, is that, so my own view about it is that, I understand freedom as necessarily emerging from concrete historical practices, like actual material conditions, and in particular as tied very deeply
to experiences of domination. So, slavery is a foundational example, but colonialism as another foundational example, and that communities that find themselves experiencing oppression then, conceive of their own emancipation as the elimination of these overwhelming forms of domination and control. Here's maybe where I have a slight difference with Will, and I'd be curious what he thinks. I think inevitably, as a political practice, when communities are contesting extreme forms of oppression and domination, they conceive not just of a freedom from, but of a positive vision of what society would in fact look like without those conditions, like what in fact emancipation looks like, even if it's only sketched, but that the positive and the negative are necessarily bound together. And in conceiving of the positive, the most emancipatory forms of these projects imagine that such liberation is going to be equal, effective, universal. And they're pressing for a society that is fundamentally different. This is the long Black freedom struggle. This is the idea of the freedom budget in the 1960s, the Poor People's Campaign. This is anti-colonial liberation across, large swaths of the world, the global South, that we see ongoing to this very day. Yet, inevitably, the actual political condition of, undermining past forms of control and creating something new doesn't, in fact, produce a universal condition of liberation. It's always still knitted together, freedom and domination. And that means that if there is this dialectic, that dialectic, in my view, is a permanent part of just being a person thrown into the world under political conditions. And so every new mode of liberation, alternative political possibility that emerges in the world still has embedded within it forms of domination that have to be contested. This is also why, my work emphasizes freedom as self-rule, but I only see that as one way of conceiving of the politics of freedom. It happens to be a very powerful one because of the concrete experiences of domination that have existed in American society. But one could imagine different circumstances in which new forms of control, subordination, corrosion actually require a very different kind of freedom language. And it's why I tend to be very, very suspicious of political arguments that say, because of freedom's, other side, it all has to be rejected. Because that's just essentially ignoring that politics inevitably is about the stitching together of the free and the unfree. And it's also tied to, I think, Will's really powerful point, which is that also then, in a weird way, in an effort to kind of honor those that are oppressed, rejects the very language that people that face oppression are using in the here and now or in the recent past to articulate the conditions for their own emancipation.
I think this is a really rich conversation, and there's so many things I want to pick up on. But to kind of connect it back to Libby's initial question, I think, is to, for me, contemplate more what freedom looks like beyond U.S. borders for a moment here. And in particular, though, I'm thinking about this from the economic realm, actually, because to free a people from domination is not to free them to have access to the means of production necessary to lead a decent quality of life in the 21st century, right? I mean, we could foresee, breaking the U.S.-Israeli alliance and actually allowing, and assisting in the freedom of the Palestinian people, but that's not necessarily to say that they will have economic access to sufficiently bring them into the 21st century. So I think it's a really fascinating question to contemplate. What do we mean by a kind of a vision and pathway towards an international solidarity around this notion of freedom? And how would we actually act on a global scale? And maybe I'm getting too into the policy weeds here, but for me, it's actually a really fascinating question, in particular, say, around the green energy transition. Really what we're seeing is kind of continued extractivism from countries like the United States and much of Europe. Why did we pass something like the Inflation Reduction Act? It's to ensure that we get ahead of other countries and then can continue to extract and dominate. It's not to actually transition an economy and actually, help us have a more sustainable future. And so I think that, is our freedom, is our economic freedom in particular rooted in the continued domination of, in particular, the third world, or are there ways that we can actually build that solidarity and, that broader and, international freedom that could be more emancipatory beyond the nation state?
So I do actually have a thought on this, but I'd love for Libby to jump back in and maybe give a stab at answering your own really wonderful question, or any the question that you raised, or any of the reflections that the three of us sort of threw back at you.
Isn't the questioner's prerogative that we don't have to answer our questions? The reason that I ask is, not because I have a pat answer in any way, but because I see this as one of the most pressing questions in everything that we are always talking about, right? So how can we envision ways of global solidarity around free Palestine that don't end up re-instantiating new forms of exploitation or brutality? What does that look like? How can we imagine, feel free to answer, great, if Will has it, how do we think about, the ways of imagining kind of true economic equality that end up actually providing everybody, what they need to live in this world? What does that look like, and how do we do it? And all of these questions, I think, I think more than the answers to them is that I get worried when we answer them with a deep sense of our own moral purity and certitude about what we know what freedom is and what it will look like for others, or even for ourselves, and how we envision it. Because I worry sometimes that this sense that our own visions are so morally pure that we don't end up seeing the remainders or the losses or the excesses that end up contributing to them. So, when I was thinking in Ugly Freedoms, part of my claim was that there is no freedom that is itself ever ideal or pure. And that so often, maybe if we think about it through Aziz's terms, if every form of freedom still carries either seeds or remainders of previous or extant forms of domination, how are we constantly making sure that, while I do see freedom as a practice and as an exercise, not as a noun, but as a verb, how do we make sure that every action and practice is something where we are trying to be attentive to what some of those actions and effects might be, and making sure that they are always about making sure that liberation is actually ongoing for more and more people, that equality is ongoing for more and more people, rather than not attending to that, or being so sure about our own moral clarity that we don't attend to those forms of domination that might be present in any act. But Will is going to answer it, so great.
Does anybody want to jump in on this point that Mark raised, which is, connected to what we've been discussing about how to think of the international? If the international has to be incorporated in our domestic understandings of what freedom means, and that if this moment, with what's happening in Gaza is such a powerful example of it, then how do we actually do that effectively as something that is a genuine way of life that connects us to people elsewhere? Any thoughts on this?
My thoughts are just, I wanted to jump on Mark's question because I wanted to just put a sharper point on it in some sense, because I actually think it's an incredibly sticky question. So, and I was thinking about, there was an interview with Motaz Zaizi, the Palestinian photojournalist, on Mehdi Hassan's final show. And Motaz said, he said something like, don't call yourself a free person if you can't stop a genocide that's still ongoing. And I think his point was that if the Israeli government can carry out a genocide in Gaza with the blessing and support of the US, of Britain, of the EU, and the people represented by those governments cannot stop it, then no one is free, right? No one can stop those governments from doing whatever they want, apparently, right? And I think that harmonizes in a sense with, I've certainly been feeling fairly powerless lately. And to me, the point of that is to think, well, so on the one hand, I do wonder, like Libby, when we're confronted with the sort of scale and scope of mobilized state power like this, are you able to keep faith with those smaller freedoms, right? Or do they seem like they're rightly thought of as ineffectual in this sort of context? But it also makes me wonder, Aziz, about your own sort of framing of the issue in terms of U.S. empire, because it seems like something new is kind of happening, which is that I know Biden has made some proposals and some noise in this direction, but he's not running a sort of imperial Keynesian program of buying quiescence at home with adventures abroad, but rather something like what you talk about as settler freedom is playing out on a global level, right? In the sense that Israel seems to be playing the role of the frontier settler, right? Destroying the savages while demanding and getting ample support and no restrictions from the government back in Washington, right? So that's not, I feel like that takes your model of settler freedom, but globalizes it. And so I there's something like your imperial framework seems like it still locates the dynamics of freedom within a domestic sphere, even if they're impacted by imperial things of policy abroad. And I just don't, I'm honestly flummoxed by how to think through the present.
Yeah, so can I jump in on sort of part of what I'm thinking? So here is, and I think you're right to note that this was a volume that was conceived in the summer and at an earlier moment in time. And here's sort of what I was thinking about where the US had reached with the politics of empire. So simply put, that both during the high tide of settler colonization and then, let's say, in the post-World War II period, we have moments in which American expansion in different ways actually serves internal economic and, let's say, political independence, well-being for a substantial part of the population. Accessing land, a condition for something like freedom as self-rule for large numbers of Americans in the 19th century. In the mid-20th century, the US's dominant global position, dollar hegemony, the reconstruction of foreign states and markets is the condition in many ways for what you were talking about, like wartime Keynesianism, but American largesse. And that this is something that I think people on the liberal left have to kind of engage with, which is the extent to which the structuring terms for domestic well-being have been these external projects, and how those external projects then have these really profound negative effects on what freedom means, on the idea that, freedom is something that's always under threat from outsiders, that is racialized, that is zero-sum, that requires a kind of belligerence. I'd say the thing that was really interesting about the last decade and the wars, really starting with the war on terror, 9/11, is that the US had basically reached a point of exhaustion where it's still essentially asserting a huge amount of power globally, and there's wealth that's being accumulated by corporate actors. But the classic story, in a way, of both the mid-19th and the mid-20th century is just less effective. And it's part of how Trump and company's turn on American sort of like globalism is part of a story about the fact that these projects have not been successful for those that are supposed to be the insiders. That doesn't mean that Trump and company are rejecting belligerence, militarism, racism, but there's a breakdown in a kind of expansionist ethic for this reason. I read Biden's politics as actually tied to something that happens in a really significant way in the US in the mid-20th century, which is a society that was a settler society reconceives itself as a universal society open to all, and indeed its interests are equivalent to the world's interests, as the first truly non-imperial country. And World War II, I think, plays a really profound role in that cultural reconstruction. The politics of World War II combined with the civil rights movement. And for somebody like Biden, he understands his support as linking the two. He does not see his support. This is like the internal psychology of a certain kind of American liberalism. He does not see his support as inconsistent with his support for mainstream civil rights projects. And what we're seeing instead, I think, before our eyes is a fundamental, let's say, fracture inconsistency between the self-mythology of America in the 20th century, World War II, the Cold War, and the practical effects of what American power is doing in ways that I think speak to a broader kind of fracture or breakdown in all of the legitimating narratives of American power, both for people within the country, that the US is actually getting something positive from it, and for folks globally. And it's why, I think one of the hard things that we'll have to kind of engage with is we're talking about freedom, but if we're thinking about freedom globally, there's a real question about the extent to which it's going to be within the US that we'll see these transformative projects, or if it's going to be elsewhere. But if it's going to be elsewhere, then it's tied to the very same problems we've seen in the US, namely that the institutions, the practical institutions that make an emancipatory account of freedom something that's real and livable for most people, the labor unions, the Black church as it existed in the 50s and 60s, you name it, those have been systematically desiccated. And so they have to be revived for a strong freedom narrative at home. But that's the same story you'd say abroad, both about unions, but more generally about the broader kind of third world internationalist tradition. It's been desiccated in ways that mean that those institutions can't claim the kind of moral authority that they should be able to. This is part of what Libby is indicating. Anyway, sorry, I went off, but those are just my reflections on that. Anybody else want to jump in on this, on the question of internationalism, on the difficulty of defending freedom in a context in which it's tied to forms of domination? Or Libby, did you want to talk a little bit about, before we open it up to questions, your the question about to what extent are non-ideal freedoms enough at a time when it feels like the problems are so massive? We can talk internationally or even just like domestically, or climate change. Will non-ideal freedoms from global ecological disaster, do we actually need to think in utopian terms about genuinely romantic alternatives and possibilities?
I mean, I think there are many ways in which these kind of smaller freedoms become even more important than ever, because there's so many ways in which when we look at the world and the problems seem so insurmountable and individuals seem to not be able to change their own lives, let alone stop, massive genocide, and things feel so horrible. I think when we only imagine that freedom happens at these large transformative scales, then in many ways it seems to block out all the work of what ordinary people can actually do to change their world. When we tell stories about freedom where it's about heroes who lead the people, who form movements and people follow them, I think, especially in a day and age when everybody is exhausted and precarious and hyperextended and terrified, that imagining that freedom is always in these large-scale heroic moments ends up being a deep form of disempowerment, which is not to say that that's never possible. But it is to say that I think we always need to be holding both, and especially thinking about what are the ways and the exercises of power that people have that they can actually do something and contribute to, even when it might seem so small and the problems of the world seem so big, right? I think we need to hold them all together rather than saying problems are too big for the smallness of who we are or what we have access to. And I think maybe that even connects to one of the questions that I see in our chat, which is about the relationship between freedom and democracy, which is something Mark brought up. I think it's something everyone brought up in different ways. But right, given the question about like that contemporary forms of democracy are so impoverished in their language, in their narrative and in their practice, then how do we think about that in terms of freedom, right? Our ability to see things, to think about these freedom at multiple scales, but also kind of democracy at multiple scales and how that plays out. I don't know if there's somebody
Yes.
who.
Mark, did you want to jump in on this, or I can jump in on freedom and
Sure.
democracy?
Yeah. Before I jump into freedom and democracy, just to follow up a little bit on Libby's earlier comment. I mean, I find this really fascinating to think about, kind of more organic, small scale freedom, not in a belittling sense, but in a individual actions being empowering and expansive of one's freedom, and very different from large scale actors. But tying that to the climate crisis for me in really interesting ways creates huge opportunities. So, Aziz raised this question of, do we have time to be utopian? And I think right now is the best time to dream and dream big, precisely because we need to rewrite our political and economic institutions in foundational ways far more quickly, I think, than we have historically because of the climate crisis. If there is a silver lining to the climate crisis, it is that it is going to force a tremendous amount of change. Now, that's not going to say that it's going to force change for good, right? I mean, I think we know that if we are not intentional about it, if we do not think big and act and organize, that the change that will inevitably occur will deepen existing inequities and will continue to further limit freedom and perhaps even roll back existing freedoms. But it also, I think, opens up just a tremendous opportunity right now for us to think about how do we expand freedoms and how do we expand access to quality livelihoods. Because, look, nobody can think about surviving the climate crisis alone. I mean, I hope Elon Musk heads to Mars. That's fine. But, we even see that the billionaires building their, bunkers for thousands of years into the future, flooding, but before they even hit the 10-year-old mark. So I do think the climate crisis highlights in ways that people often insulate themselves from just how of a collective project we are in together. And I think that's in ways that really excite me. And in terms of democracy, I mean, and I'm going to tie this to one of the other questions in the chat around free time and leisure. So Martin Hagland has this lovely book called This Life that really talks about time as our scarcest asset, our scarcest resource. And I think it's an idea that really resonated with me quite tremendously. And look, Libby just talked about when we're all feeling so overwhelmed as it is. We're all working 55, 60 hours a week and have kids and have to do reproductive labor to feed our kids and care for them and the like. It's tremendously overwhelming. But I think that a lack of time is a excellent example of a lack of true freedom. If we don't have time to, engage in life beyond both necessary work time and then the time to reproduce ourselves in the next generation as workers, then what are we doing? We're hamsters on a hamster wheel. What is the point of this? And so I think time is precisely one of the key venues in which we should be contesting the current terrain. And I think people often think about this as rollback and the work day. But I think one of the really undervalued and potentially more politically tractionable areas to attack this is thinking about how do we expand things like PTO and paid vacation time and family leave and just other crucial areas that provide workers more time to be humans and more time to fulfill their identity beyond worker, because nobody can be free if their only identity is worker in terms of being, under a dominating boss, which is where most of us spend the vast majority of our working days.
I just, note something that in the forum, we have a wonderful piece by Julie Rose on just this point about time. I'd strongly recommend that the folks in the chat and the person that raised this to take a look at that essay that makes exactly this point and the centrality of time actually to free experience, and links it in a way that I think is really interesting to the arguments that Will was making. So, Will was emphasizing something that I think is really significant, that that freedom is built around notions of power and counterpower, the capacity to be able to collectively organize authority in ways to contest hegemonic forms of domination and control. And that in a deep sense, I think the problem of a lack of institutions in the US is a lack of the foundations for counterpower. But that free time, claiming back your time as a way of engaging in counterpower, it changes the bargaining terms of the relationship between worker and employer. This is one of the ways in which leisure is essential, is like, I think, essential to thinking both about freedom and meaningful control. I just add one thing on democracy before turning it to other folks, that, I think something that came up as a theme in a lot of the comments in the forum that's tied to this is the importance of, and Mark said this explicitly, the importance of thinking of democracy not as a matter of, just electoral process, though elections obviously are very important, but as something that is deeply embedded in how people experience all of the institutions that affect them. It's just deeply embedded in their cultural worlds, in the kind of place that they work, the type of family that they're part of. There's a wonderful piece as well about the importance of changing the terms of the family as a way of actually creating, more emancipatory spaces there. And this really reminds me of an historian and thinker that's been very important to my own writing, this is Lawrence Goodwin, who's a historian of populism. And Goodwin, when he writes about populism, and I think of this as something that's essential to movements generally, talks about how essentially left movements are about the fact that people inhabit received cultures. They inhabit worlds that are deeply hierarchical, in which they have limited control over the terms of their own life, and they face various kinds of oppression and domination. And what all of these movements are interested in doing is changing those received cultures into something that are movement cultures. In other words, making all of the spaces that they inhabit democratic in the sense that they can actually have their voice heard, assert control, participate in decisions about. And that way of thinking of democracy as embedded in a shift from received to movement culture, or a way of contesting power with counterpower, or a way of organizing workplaces so that they're embodiments of self-determination, self-rule, depending on how you present this, strikes me as really essential. And that, of course, still recognizes that democracy itself can have all of the exclusions and corrosive implications that we've discussed with freedom. It's not an end run. Democracy, there's ethno-democracy, there's democracies that are the defense of limiting the capacity of people to move, that are forms of controlling migration, but that there are ways still of linking together freedom and democracy so that people's experiences on a daily life are embodiments of their actual desires and will. Sorry. Will, did you want to jump in on any of this?
Well, I guess there's a question in the chat that I thought would be worth addressing. It's been, we've sort of bounced off it in various ways, but it's this one that asks basically is there a contradiction between the idea that a left view of freedom is necessarily a universal one, and the idea that a robust concept of freedom has to be grounded in questions of power. I think something like this has undergirded some of your comments, Aziz. It's undergirded all of our comments in some way or another, I think. And someone else in the chat asks about what's the difference between freedom and liberation, or is there a difference between freedom and liberation? I think these are important questions. I also think one of the things that comes out of the issue as a whole, or the whole forum around reclaiming freedom, is I think for most of us, freedom it's an inherently sort of unruly political ideal, right? It's not, and I think connecting it to power underscores that in a particular way. That the attempts to get free always themselves mean building power, and building power is always going to have its blind spots. You're going to build institutions to contest existing power, and that and those institutions are themselves going to subordinate some people's desires to other people's desires. So a classic example of this is you can't have unions, you can't have a union movement without strong cultures of solidarity. And part of that strong cultural solidarity is also like anti-scab norms, right? So if you want unions, and if you think that unions are good ways of workers building power and gaining greater freedom, both at work and greater freedom from work, then you have to accept that the creation of those institutions is also going to involve imposing certain things on some individual workers, right? If you try to cross the picket line, you're going to get called a scab. You're going to be shunned, perhaps, by your community. You're going to be intimidated. You might get beat up, right? Like that. There are enforcement mechanisms for norms. Like you can't have an institution unless there are norms and rules, and you can't have those unless you have enforcement mechanisms. Those are going to make certain individuals unfree for the sake of the larger fight for freedom. And I think that's always true. Like that's part of what any attempt to get free is going to produce forms of unfreedom. And sometimes those forms of unfreedom can be justified by what they do for the larger movement, and sometimes they can't. Sometimes they overwhelm the movement. Sometimes they end up producing something that is worse than what we had before. But I think that notion that yes, freedom is a matter of power, and that means it's a matter. It's going to be messy, and there's no simple way of just getting free by somehow being free automatically or magically.
Well, can I ask you a question on this? Which is, so
Yeah.
I can't tell whether or not this is a disagreement. That I don't necessarily view all circumstances in which people's wills are thwarted as an indicator that they're unfree. And in a way, I see this as a potential difference between elements of the left and liberals. In other words, there's a way in which universality, or the idea of universal freedom for certain kinds of liberal politics, assumes that there needs to be consensus. In other words, like, unless everybody agrees to a certain set of arrangements, then some people are necessarily unfree. And I read some elements of like left tradition as saying no, that precisely because society, as you know, everybody here written extensively, divided between those with power and those without, that there are these structural, foundational divisions, that the condition by which everybody gets free is necessarily winners and losers. Some people will actually have to be defeated politically. And that defeat means that their will be thwarted, but that they're therefore unfree. Because, take King, the thought is that the interest, like the condition by which Black people are liberated in the US is the condition by which everyone is liberated, even if some range of people end up losing politically or necessarily have to lose politically. And that there's a kind of liberal desire to imagine that this can take place through consensual agreement, and that's foundationally tied to a liberal view that unless your will is being articulated in every single circumstance, then somehow you're unfree.
Yeah, and I think there is a disagreement here, but it's not quite that one. I want to try to have a third option between those two, because I think you're unfree if you're like subject to a power that can thwart not just your wishes, but can impact your interests in a way that you can't control. And for me, that's what it means to be dominated, and I think that's what it means to be unfree fundamentally, is to be subject to that power. So that means so I don't want this notion of in order to, like, freedom is just this space of consensus. But I also don't. I think the notion that well, it's really in the long-term or higher interest of the king to be a free participant in, just a citizen, just part of the universal class of free and equal persons. Like, that's a sort of moral interest that I think that's also a bit convenient, right? That gives us, I think that makes it gives us an excuse to disregard what people say they want. It gives us a reason to disregard what people say they care about, in the name of saying, well, but your real interests are some other thing that I know, and according to those real interests, you're going to be free. We're going to force you to be free, right? And I guess I want to refuse both of those and just say, like, yeah, like someone who thinks that, yeah, like, just like any other worker, they're working in order to feed their family. They're working in order to get enough money to live. And now, like, a bunch of other people who didn't talk to them are saying to them, well, no, you have to not work. You have to not work and be on our side. And only if we all bind together, then we'll be able to get better concessions from the boss, and we'll be able to be freer. And if that one person says, no, I want to work, I want to get my paycheck, and that's what I want, I don't think we can say, well, we're going to force you to be free by joining us. I think we have to just bite the bullet and say, no, we're going to exercise some power over you that you can't control. And that's going to be a local freedom that we're going to hopefully justify by actually winning some greater freedom in the end.
Does anybody want to jump on this or on another topic?
Just real quickly, I'll just add that, I think Aziz laid it out nicely in terms of the traditional distinction between left and liberal, and that's my understanding as well. And I don't want to put words in your mouth, Will, but maybe you see a bigger distinction between solidarity and freedom than I do, and maybe you see that, and at least what I'm understanding you saying is, for me, solidarity and freedom go hand in hand in more inseparable ways than what I understand you saying. And it sounds like perhaps there's more of a tension in your understanding of freedom between solidarity and freedom. And I think that's if that's the case, I do think that's an interesting distinction to tease out. And that also plays in nicely to the earlier point that, freedom can never be universally, unconditionally won. Right, that there is always going to be a degree of unfreedom and struggle and tension, and that is perhaps inherent in the human condition. And I think that that's probably quite right outside of the utopian writers.
I mean, I would just add to that I think some of this goes back to the question about the relationship between democracy and freedom, right? Because if we understand democracy to be having a say in the conditions that govern your life alongside all others who also have a say, or having the power to shape the conditions of our lives, there's a way in which that connects very deeply to the understandings of freedom, of something like self-rule or self-determination. And then the question is, where does that reside? Is that something that we determine collectively? Is that something, having a say? What does that look like? What are the conditions? Is that something that people individually figure out on their own? And I think some of these questions about, like, the labor union or who has a say ends up being, where do we actually find where that power resides and where it is exercised? How can we trust have a kind of solidarity of trust of a collective where even if you are not necessarily agreeing, like that's kind of what, that's the shape that the kind of creative conditions that we want to live in can take hold, even if that might not be something that somebody individually is like invested in at any particular time. But I also think that leads us to the question of what are these visions and can they ever be universal? Or, and I think that they are not and that they don't have to be, right? Many people have said here that freedom comes out of the specific conditions of domination or conditions of unfreedom, which is what I take to be one of the most important kind of interventions of 20th century critical thought, right? That freedom is not this kind of state of willing or state of existing, but it's always particular and concrete and coming out of, kind of lived conditions of unfreedom that people are fighting for something more. But that doesn't mean then either that what people are fighting for is either the same or that everybody is necessarily, right, that what that is going to be is going to look the same at all times. Climate change might be a perfect example of that. And I think, the Kim Stanley Robinson book, Ministry for the Future, helps us to see all of the ways in which people can fight collectively for climate in ways that are exercise different forms of power and freedom that might not align with one another. They're somewhat anarchic in the sense that they originate from different communities and different values, but in the end, they end up collectively, what he calls, right, revolution in a minor key or slow revolution of actually, dramatically shifting climate in ways that is not necessarily organized or universal, except for the fact that people all want to live on this earth.
So we're coming close to the end of time. I was going to say one thing on this, which is I do think that Mark is really right to point out a potential tension. I mean these are friendly tensions around this question of solidarity, because it does sound like part of the stakes here is sort of to the extent to which we should defend an idea of freedom that is ultimately inherently almost interdependent, or is freedom something that is like grounded in a way in the individual, and that when individuals have specific desires, needs, wants that society ends up constraining, that is unfree. My worry about that politically is that feels very close to a replication of a kind of libertarian ethic that we've seen sort of metastasized on the right. Conceptually, my worry about it is that, all of the movements that I think of, and here, I'm thinking about like labor republicanism and sort of socialist politics around labor that say, well, how is it that we deal with complex structures of domination? That the only way under conditions of modern complexity to deal with them is through accounts of emancipation that are collective and that understand the collective as having a kind of weight independent of the individual. So I feel like there's a potential tension here. I don't know. I don't go back. Like Will can respond, and then we can see if have we missed any questions that we should engage with that folks have raised. But maybe. Well, you want to take a...
I'll just respond very quickly, because...
Was I clear? I don't know if I was clear on the
I think you were clear. And I just want to say, to allay any concerns that my fellow panelists have or that sort of thing. I do think that a basic condition of one of the problems that faces us in trying to figure out how we could have a global left right now is precisely that we're all very aware of how interdependent we are, and therefore of how much our actual basic interests are tied to one another's. And that therefore we need to figure out institutions that do not secure, just institutions that secure local freedom are not going to secure freedom for everyone in this globe. It's just not, it's not true. So I completely agree with you that we have to think freedom and interdependency together. I do think that solidarity is crucial for that. I just think it's separate from that. Like solidarity is a necessary condition for anything like universal freedom, absolutely. But that doesn't mean that solidarity is itself baked into freedom or part of freedom. That's all. There can be tensions between solidarity and freedom as well.
Libby, I noted that there's a question in the chat. I don't know if you wanted to engage with it. Basically, it's about that can freedom be de-idealized in ways that sort of can we actually de-idealize freedom if the very long history of freedom and its integral place in society today is inextricably tied to the history that has positioned it as ideal in the first place? I don't know. It's a long question, and but I don't know if there's any reflections that sort of tie to what we've got in the chat here that you wanted to jump in on. I'm sorry to put you on the spot. But
no, I don't. Unfortunately, I don't have time to read the whole question. Although if whoever posed it would like to email me it, I'm super happy to answer it that way. But I guess the question, is about. I mean, maybe this is something that we can all kind of think about as our last moment, because I noticed we also have a question on movement. But maybe it's about what is the are we ever really even de-idealizing something if so much of our language and inheritance from it is coming from traditions that are otherwise doing different work or otherwise maybe the question is in part how do we think out of, if we're trying to think about what the world can be differently, how do we think out of forms of freedom that have always been posed that are so violent? Though I think we are also at the same time looking at various traditions that are asking us to think about things in other ways, like something like labor republicanism or other ways of imagining what freedom can be. What does it mean to work alongside other people who practice it? How do we partake in its exercise? And even though I think Will was suggesting, for him, freedom is about a condition of being free, but I would also suggest it is always about, for me at least, how are we exercising what's possible? And that, freedom is about the practice and the exercise rather than the condition. And maybe that's particular to the US context, because I think Americans so often rest in their laurels about this as a place of being free. And that once you are free, you've done the work, and whatever you do in its wake doesn't matter because you are, ipso facto free. And so I think, it's that is where I see the work of exercising freedom or practices of movement to work out of.
Should we go around and just final thoughts on this? I'm happy to jump in. I mean, so this question of how to think about the kind of fraught double history of freedom in the U.S. and globally, but let's say specifically in the U.S., that I think Mark is absolutely right. It's the master narrative. I think a significant part of why it's the master narrative has to do with U.S. foundations in settler expansion, that the logic of settlerism created a kind of internal politics that emphasized notions of liberty and freedom in ways that were real for people, but had all of these destructive consequences. And so for me, I feel like I try to, to the extent possible, to hold two kinds of arguments in common at the same time. One is that for all of this, both in the US and globally, we have really rich traditions that, oftentimes suppressed, but rich traditions nonetheless of various movements and activists that have imagined otherwise, that have genuinely conceived of how we can have a politics that's equal and effective for everyone. And that these traditions are resources, whether or not they're kind of present right now, and that they're part of a kind of collective memory that has to be safeguarded and marshaled in our own moments. But at the same time, I feel like we have to be, truly realistic about the structural constraints that we face in the present. like what the nature of the world is that we inhabit, the forms of power and domination that exist, the ways in which those forms of power and domination replicate, undermine modes of agency. And by holding the two together, then we can think really seriously about, well, what are the types of agency and action that can be pursued now? And it's one of the reasons why for my piece, I wanted to emphasize the arguments about institutions and the institutional frame that people inhabit, because it strikes me that whatever our goals are, they require having a commitment to narrative, and I think even truly utopian in the best sense narrative, but an awareness about, well, what are the conditions under which those narratives actually can live and breathe, and then attempting to build the politics through forms of counterpower, through the reconstruction of our daily institutions, workplaces, schools, political communities that allow actual agency to take root on behalf of something that is genuinely emancipatory. Mark, Will, bring us home. Both of you, I hope.
Sure. I mean, I guess I'll just say very quickly that like one of the things that I take away from my study of Marx is that like part of imagining or part of thinking about what is possible, part of thinking about analytically thinking about the world, analyzing the powers and structures of the world is to understand that those structures and that world are in movement. And so part of that analysis has to be identifying like parts of what is moving in the world that might be able to take us somewhere better. And I mean, it does seem to me that right now, both the climate crisis and the wars that have plagued us at least since 2001, 2002, have unleashed a movement of refugees that is pretty unparalleled. And I think that thinking about this picks up on that question about freedom of movement. I do think freedom for refugees, freedom of the moving, and movements of refugees and migrants, diasporic movements, like I think that those might be promising places to start thinking about what sorts of freedom we might be able to build in the next 50 years that might be sustainable.
Mark, final word.
I've really enjoyed this conversation this evening, and I've learned a tremendous amount from my fellow panelists here. I think that parting thoughts are one, I would encourage us all to also think more about how to bring a left vision of freedom to broader audiences. I think that that is not the intent of this forum, or to be clear, but nevertheless, I think that's something that the left has particularly failed at is articulating this vision and working to broaden our tent. And that's something that I want to challenge both myself and all of us to do, is to break down these ideas in ways to help people understand how they can meaningfully fight to expand their freedoms, both in the long run, but also in the here and now. And that can be from fighting for reproductive rights, to fighting for leisure time, to fighting for a wage that means people can, send their kids to school and put food on the table and not worry about rent and healthcare. But, we need to continue to help people understand the material as well as political wins to defend, expand, and deepen freedoms today.
Well, thanks so much to all of you for the conversation. Thanks to everybody that joined us online for this discussion, to Haymarket and Boston Review again, and hope to see folks again before too long.
Thank you, Aziz.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
It's good to see everybody.